Byberry began with fields, fresh air, and a promise that Philadelphia's mentally ill poor would no longer be crowded into an aging almshouse. The first patients arrived at the city farm in 1911. 3 years later, more than 2,200 people were already living there. By 1947, the population had reached 6,100. A rural refuge created to relieve overcrowding had become one of the largest custodial institutions in Pennsylvania. This is how a place built as an act of reform became Philadelphia's most infamous asylum. Long before Byberry became a name associated with locked wards and public scandal, Philadelphia's burden of caring for its poorest residents was concentrated along the west bank of the Schuylkill River. There stood Blockley Almshouse, a sprawling municipal institution that had grown from a 19th-century poorhouse into something resembling a city within the city. Its buildings contained a public hospital, workrooms, shelters, and an asylum. The elderly, the sick, the homeless, and those described in official language as insane could all pass through the same system, not because their needs were alike, but because they shared one condition government understood clearly: they had nowhere else to go. By the beginning of the 20th century, Blockley no longer stood beyond Philadelphia. The city had expanded around it. Streets, hospitals, universities, and neighborhoods pressed against land that had once seemed remote. Inside, the Department for People with Mental Illness had become severely overcrowded. Men and women who required careful attention were gathered in aging buildings designed for containment more than recovery. The problem was visible and persistent. Philadelphia needed another place. City officials were not planning a modern psychiatric center filled with laboratories, specialists, and individualized treatment. Psychiatry still had limited power to cure the conditions placed under its authority. There were few effective medicines, little community support, and no dependable public system for people whose illnesses made employment or family life difficult. The immediate purpose was more basic. Blockley needed space, and the city needed somewhere to send the people occupying it. The answer lay in the far northeastern reaches of Philadelphia, in an area that still looked more like countryside than city. Byberry City Farms belonged to the municipal poor relief system. It offered open land and distance from the crowded districts where most Philadelphians lived. To officials searching for a practical solution, the farm seemed to offer both economy and reform. That combination reflected an older ideal in American mental health care. During the 19th century, reformers had argued that people suffering from mental disturbance should not be kept in jails, chained in poorhouses, or abandoned in family backrooms. They believed that a well-ordered asylum could provide a more humane alternative. Calm surroundings, clean air, sunlight, useful work, and a regular daily routine were thought capable of restoring stability, especially when illness was recognized early. The principle was often called moral treatment. The word moral did not mean that illness was a punishment for bad character. In its better form, the idea held that patients should be treated as human beings whose surroundings could either deepen their distress or help relieve it. A quiet landscape was not merely decorative, it was part of the treatment. Distance from the noise and pressure of the city was supposed to give the mind room to settle. Byberry appeared suited to that promise. Its fields could supply food. Its open spaces could provide movement and light. Patients considered able to work could tend crops, care for animals, repair buildings, or assist with the daily operation of the property. Such labor was described as therapeutic because it offered structure and purpose. It also reduced the cost of running a public institution. Those two explanations were never entirely separate. For some patients, outdoor work may have been preferable to confinement in a crowded ward. A day in the fields could bring exercise and usefulness that institutional life often denied. Yet patient labor also allowed the city to maintain a large facility without hiring enough paid workers. What could be presented as treatment could also become an economic necessity. The farm was expected to care for its residents, and its residents were expected to help sustain the farm. The exact beginning of Byberry depends on what is being counted. Later accounts often identify 1906 or 1907 as the year the project began, reflecting the city's early purchase and use of the farmland and the arrival of small work details. But the clearest scholarly chronology places the first formal transfer of patients from Blockley's overcrowded insane department in 1911. 2 years later, Blockley stopped accepting new patients into that department. From that point forward, Byberry was no longer an experiment at the edge of the system. It was becoming the system. The move could still be defended as progress. A separate campus devoted to people with mental illness was better in principle than leaving them mixed into a general poorhouse or confined beside prisoners. Families unable to afford private care might reasonably hope that the city was finally creating a place designed for their relatives. The name City Farms suggested health and renewal. It carried none of the associations that Byberry would acquire later. But the location solved more than a medical problem. It also solved a problem of visibility. At Blockley, institutional poverty stood near Philadelphia's growing medical district. At Byberry, the same people could be moved toward the city's outer boundary, beyond the daily sight of most taxpayers and officials. The landscape that promised peace also created distance. Distance could protect patients from the city, but it could also protect the city from having to look closely at them. That contradiction was present before the great wards, before the state takeover, and before the photographs that would make Byberry nationally notorious. The institution was founded partly on a humane belief that surroundings mattered. It was also founded on an administrative desire to move large numbers of dependent people out of an overcrowded building quickly and cheaply. In 1911, the first formal group left Blockley for the farmland in northeast Philadelphia. They traveled away from brick corridors and dense streets toward open ground that officials believed could provide a new beginning. For a brief moment, Byberry could still be imagined as a retreat rather than a warehouse. But Philadelphia had not created it slowly enough to test that promise. The city had created it because pressure demanded relief, and the pressure was already following the patients through the gate. In 1913, Philadelphia made a decision that quietly changed the meaning of Byberry. Blockley would no longer accept new patients into its department for the mentally ill. The city had not solved the problem that crowded those wards. It had redirected the flow. From then on, people who depended on public care would be sent toward the farms in northeast Philadelphia, and the rural outpost created to relieve another institution began becoming an institution of its own. Buildings followed the patients. Male and female dormitories rose on separate parts of the property, joined by infirmaries, kitchens, laundries, warehouses, workshops, employee housing, utility structures, and roads connecting one group to another. The arrangement was more open than Blockley's dense urban complex. From a distance, it could resemble farm buildings scattered across the countryside. Yet Byberry was no ordinary hospital. A general hospital treated an illness or injury and expected most patients to leave. Byberry had to provide nearly every part of life for people who might remain for years. It received them, assigned them to wards, issued clothing, prepared meals, supervised work, recorded behavior, and decided when they could be discharged. When residents died, the institution recorded the death and arranged what followed. The longer people stayed, the more completely the hospital replaced the world outside. This was how a campus became a closed city. Food had to arrive in enormous quantities or be produced on the grounds. Clothing and bedding had to be washed continuously. Boilers supplied heat. Pipes, roofs, roads, and machinery required repair. Patients needed medical attention, but the institution also needed cooks, attendants, farm laborers, mechanics, clerks, and guards. Some work was performed by paid employees. Much of it was assigned to patients under the language of occupation and therapy. For some residents, work offered routine and relief from the monotony of a ward, but it also tied treatment to the needs of the institution. A patient could be considered useful because he could shovel coal, repair a fence, or carry laundry, even when little was being done to understand the condition that brought him there. The hospital's survival depended upon labor, making it easy to confuse a productive work detail with recovery. The population grew with astonishing speed. By 1914, only 3 years after the first formal transfers from Blockley, Byberry held 2,267 residents. It was already the largest of Pennsylvania's county mental institutions and larger than nearly every state hospital in the Commonwealth. A place still taking shape had filled before Philadelphia had fully decided what it should become. The number represented a real public need. Families across the city cared for relatives who heard voices, became severely depressed, suffered seizures, lost memory, or could no longer manage ordinary life. Some households had neither the money for private treatment nor enough adults to provide constant supervision. Apartments were crowded and workdays long. A person in crisis might wander away or require more care than a family could safely give. Admission did not always mean that relatives were indifferent. For many, Byberry was the only door the public system left open. A mother, husband, sister, or adult child might sign papers not because they wished to remove someone from the family, but because every other arrangement had failed or never existed. Once inside, residents were fitted into official categories. Surviving records separated people by sex and race and counted those described as epileptic, tubercular, intellectually disabled, or mentally ill. The language reflects the medical assumptions and social prejudices of the period. Labels officials treated as precise could gather together people with very different needs. Epilepsy might be placed beside psychosis. Intellectual disability might be treated as mental disease. Poverty, immigration, age, behavior, and family conflict could influence who was judged unable to remain outside. Byberry became a destination for people whom other parts of the city did not know how to classify, support, or tolerate. Some were severely ill. Some had lifelong disabilities. Others entered after encounters with police, courts, poor relief officials, or exhausted relatives. Their paths were different, but Byberry gave them the same address. The openness of the grounds concealed how complete that separation could become. A visitor saw lawns and fields rather than a single massive wall. But the same distance that suggested freedom placed residents far from neighborhoods, relatives, newspapers, and the daily attention of city officials. Byberry was part of Philadelphia, yet it stood where most Philadelphians rarely had reason to see it. Its changing names revealed an institution still searching for an identity. In 1928, the city called it the Philadelphia Institution for the Feeble-Minded, using a term then accepted by officials, but now recognized as demeaning and medically imprecise. In 1931, it became the Philadelphia Hospital for Mental Diseases. The newer name suggested a more professional purpose. A farm colony was being recast as a hospital expected not only to shelter people but to diagnose and treat them. The buildings, however, had already learned a different lesson. Each time Blockley or the city's relief system came under pressure, Byberry could answer by adding another ward, another dormitory, or another group of residents. Expansion appeared to prove that the institution was useful. Beds were created, cases were transferred, and an immediate administrative crisis became less visible. But every new bed divided the available attention among more people. Byberry was growing faster than Philadelphia's ability to staff it, define its patients, or provide the care promised by the word hospital. By the end of the 1920s, the farm beyond the city had become a city of its own. It had roads, kitchens, workshops, wards, and thousands of residents. What it did not yet have was enough room to become the place its new name claimed it was, and the admissions had only begun. Byberry had been created to relieve overcrowding, but it soon discovered that relief could never last. Every building completed on the grounds created space for another transfer. Every transfer reduced pressure somewhere else in Philadelphia. The institution expanded, yet the demand waiting beyond its gates expanded faster. During its first 2 decades, the number of residents rose more quickly than the city could construct wards, recruit attendants, or train medical staff. New buildings did not bring Byberry closer to a stable capacity. They simply allowed the hospital to accept the next group of people for whom no other public place could be found. By 1934, more than 4,500 residents were living in a complex judged suitable for approximately 2,500. The problem was no longer a temporary shortage caused by an unexpected rise in admissions. The institution was operating at nearly twice the population it could reasonably support. Numbers of that size changed the meaning of care. A physician could not know thousands of residents as individuals. Attendants responsible for crowded wards had little time to observe subtle changes in behavior or listen to a patient explain what was wrong. Meals had to be distributed, bodies washed, floors cleaned, clothing issued, fights interrupted, and doors secured. The workday was shaped by what had to be completed for the entire ward, not by what might help one person recover. The contrast with private mental hospitals in the Philadelphia region was difficult to ignore. Institutions such as Friends Hospital served patients whose families could pay for care or obtain charitable assistance. Some private sanitaria had unused rooms, while Byberry placed people wherever space could be created. The difference was not simply that private physicians understood mental illness better. It was that private institutions could limit admissions. They could decide how many patients they were prepared to receive. Byberry had been built for people who possessed no comparable choice. A family with money might consult several doctors, arrange nursing at home, or move a relative to a quieter hospital with landscaped grounds and a smaller population. A poor family usually entered the public system at the point of crisis. Once police, courts, relief officials, or public physicians became involved, Byberry often stood at the end of the process. The institution, therefore, received people according to need rather than its ability to care for them. This distinction shaped almost everything that followed. Those with private options could search for treatment. Those without them were sent to the place where the city hoped another bed could still be found. Sometimes the word bed described little more than a position in a crowded room. Mattresses could be placed close together or moved into corridors and common areas. Privacy disappeared first. Quiet followed. A person suffering from fear, confusion, or hallucinations might spend each day surrounded by voices, movement, and the distress of dozens of other residents. The environment intended to calm the mind could now intensify the very symptoms it was supposed to treat. Overcrowding also changed the role of employees. Attendants entered a workplace where maintaining order could seem more urgent than understanding illness. Even a patient who needed patience and conversation might be approached primarily as someone who had to be fed, moved, dressed, or kept from disrupting the ward. Most attendants were not necessarily cruel. Many worked long shifts for modest wages inside buildings with too few employees and too many residents. But an institution does not require every worker to be malicious in order to become harmful. It only requires conditions in which the quickest response repeatedly replaces the most humane one. Restraint offered one such response. A person who was frightened, agitated, or resisting instructions could require time, space, and careful attention. When neither time nor staff was available, tying the person down or placing them alone behind a door could restore order more quickly. Seclusion and physical restraint had recognized medical uses in emergencies, but in an overcrowded institution they could become tools of routine management. The same was true of inactivity. Byberry had once emphasized outdoor labor and regular occupation. As wards filled, some residents continued working in laundries, kitchens, farms, and maintenance crews. Others spent long hours sitting, standing, or lying in rooms where there was little meaningful activity. Their days were controlled without being directed toward recovery. By the 1930s, conditions inside Byberry were no longer entirely hidden from Philadelphia. Local newspapers published descriptions and photographs of leaking roofs, deteriorated buildings, poor sanitation, and residents left without adequate clothing or supervision. Reports described a public institution that had exceeded its capacity so completely that neglect had become part of its ordinary operation. These disclosures produced anger, but they also revealed an uncomfortable truth. Philadelphia had not accidentally overlooked a small hospital on its outskirts. The city had continued sending people there, while knowing that the institution lacked the space and personnel to receive them properly. Byberry's failures were part of a wider crisis in Pennsylvania's county mental hospitals. Conditions varied from place to place, but many local governments lacked the money, professional staff, or political will to maintain adequate care. Reformers increasingly argued that mental hospitals should not depend on the resources and priorities of individual counties. In 1938, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania assumed control of Byberry. The transfer promised a larger system, more professional supervision, and access to resources beyond Philadelphia's municipal budget. The institution received another official identity, Philadelphia State Hospital. The new name suggested that Byberry had finally completed its transformation. It was no longer a farm colony attached to Poor Relief or a municipal facility built mainly to empty Blockley. It was now part of Pennsylvania's hospital system, governed by the state and presented as a medical institution. Yet the Commonwealth had not inherited a functioning hospital that merely required better administration. It had inherited thousands of residents, an exhausted physical plant, a culture formed under chronic overcrowding, and a public expectation that Byberry would continue accepting those no one else could accommodate. A state government could replace administrators. It could authorize construction, revise regulations, and repaint the name above the entrance. What it could not easily change was the purpose the buildings had learned through decades of use. Byberry had been designed as a rural answer to an urban crisis. By the time Pennsylvania took control, it had become a vast community organized around shortage. It provided shelter because treatment was scarce, custody because support outside the gates was weaker, and beds because Philadelphia continued to produce emergencies faster than it produced alternatives. The words Philadelphia State Hospital now stood at the entrance. Inside the wards, the distance between the promise of a hospital and the reality of the institution had never been greater. And soon men sent there for reasons having nothing to do with psychiatry would carry evidence of that distance beyond the gates. In 1942, while the United States was sending millions of men into military service, a smaller group arrived at Philadelphia State Hospital for a very different kind of duty. They were conscientious objectors, men who refused to take part in war because their religious convictions would not permit them to kill. Under the Civilian Public Service Program, they were assigned to work considered necessary to the nation. At Byberry, that meant entering some of the most crowded and neglected psychiatric wards in Pennsylvania. Civilian Public Service Unit 49 did not arrive as a commission of experts. Its members were not psychiatrists, inspectors, or investigative journalists. They worked as attendants and orderlies, performing the intimate labor that kept the hospital moving from one shift to the next. They washed patients, carried food, changed bedding, cleaned wards, moved residents between buildings, and tried to maintain order in rooms holding far more people than the staff could properly supervise. Many came from Quaker, Mennonite, Brethren, and other Peace Church traditions. Their objections to violence had placed them outside the military, but those same convictions now shaped the way they understood what happened inside Byberry. Practices that experienced employees described as necessary did not always appear necessary to men trained to question the use of force. They saw residents struck for moving too slowly, resisting instructions, or failing to understand what was being asked of them. They saw physical restraint used not only during genuine emergencies, but as a practical response to a shortage of time and staff. They encountered people who had been treated for so long as problems to be controlled that even ordinary fear or confusion could be interpreted as defiance. The conscientious objectors did not enter a simple world divided between innocent patients and cruel attendants. Many longtime employees were exhausted. Some worked under conditions that made careful treatment nearly impossible. A single attendant might be responsible for a large ward filled with people who needed constant attention. Violence could come from patients as well as staff, and a moment of disorder could place everyone nearby at risk. But the newcomers also recognized how easily an emergency method could become a habit. If force restored quiet quickly, it might be used before patience had been tried. If a resident was expected to resist, staff might approach him with aggression from the beginning. The hospital had developed its own internal logic, one in which harsh treatment appeared reasonable because harsh treatment had already shaped the behavior it was intended to control. Some members of Unit 49 began experimenting with another approach. They spoke calmly to residents who had previously been handled by several men. They offered food without threats. They allowed patients more time to respond. When possible, they reduced the use of physical restraint and treated the people in their care as adults rather than as objects passing through a routine. The results were modest, but difficult to dismiss. Residents described as uncontrollable sometimes became less combative when attendants stopped approaching them as though violence were inevitable. People who appeared unreachable sometimes responded to direct conversation, familiar tasks, or simple recognition. These changes did not prove that kindness could cure severe mental illness. They revealed something more immediate. Part of what Byberry classified as disturbed behavior was being produced or intensified by the institution itself. The men began writing down what they witnessed. Warren Sawyer and others sent letters, gathered accounts, and communicated with conscientious objectors assigned to mental hospitals elsewhere in the country. Their reports showed that Byberry was not an isolated failure. Similar patterns appeared in state institutions from one region to another. Overcrowded wards, poorly trained attendants, routine restraint, inadequate clothing, and residents left without meaningful activity. The war had unintentionally created a network of witnesses. Men who might otherwise never have entered a psychiatric hospital were now working inside them, comparing conditions and carrying information between institutions. Their shared religious background and civilian public service experience gave them a structure through which private observations could become organized evidence. From these efforts emerged the National Mental Health Foundation, later known as the National Foundation for Mental Health. Its purpose was not merely to improve one building in Philadelphia. The group wanted to make conditions inside state hospitals a public issue and to challenge the belief that people lost their claim to dignity once they crossed an institutional gate. Written testimony, however, could still be dismissed as exaggeration. Byberry's administrators could argue that inexperienced outsiders did not understand the realities of psychiatric care. The public could read descriptions of crowded wards and still imagine something less severe than what actually existed. Charlie Lord decided that the country needed to see. Lord carried a small camera beneath his clothing and entered wards where photography was forbidden. He could not openly raise the camera, frame each image, and adjust the focus. He exposed 3 rolls of film without looking through the viewfinder, never knowing precisely what the lens had captured. When the photographs were developed, they showed what official reports had struggled to convey. Men sat or stood without clothing in bare rooms. Patients lay close together on floors and benches. Walls, windows, and furnishings showed years of deterioration. The images contained no dramatic single act around which blame could easily be organized. Their power came from the ordinary nature of what they revealed. Neglect had become the setting of daily life. In 1945, reformers brought the photographs to Eleanor Roosevelt. She was already familiar with reports of poor conditions in public institutions, particularly in states with limited resources. Yet she reportedly found it difficult at first to believe that these images came from Philadelphia, one of the country's largest cities, and a center of medicine, education, and government. That reaction exposed an assumption Byberry had long depended upon. Americans could imagine neglect in an isolated county or an impoverished region. It was harder to accept that such conditions existed within the boundaries of a major northern city, only miles from universities and respected hospitals. On May 6, 1946, Life magazine published Bedlam 1946, an investigation of state mental hospitals that drew on evidence from Byberry and Cleveland State Hospital. The article placed images of neglected psychiatric patients before a national audience at a particularly charged moment. Americans had recently seen photographs from the liberation of concentration camps in Europe. Some journalists and reformers used comparisons shaped by those images to describe the institutions they found at home. The language reflected the moral urgency of the period, but the histories were not the same and should not be treated as interchangeable. What the comparison revealed was the depth of public disbelief. Conditions once defended as unfortunate necessities were now being judged against the basic standards of a society that had gone to war speaking of human dignity. The photographs damaged Byberry's ability to hide behind medical language. They helped create pressure for investigations, higher spending, better training, and national reform. They also gave patients a visible presence in a debate that had usually taken place among officials. But exposure did not empty the wards. When the magazine disappeared from newsstands, the people in Charlie Lord's photographs remained inside Philadelphia State Hospital. New administrators could be appointed and new buildings proposed, but Pennsylvania still had thousands of residents who required housing, supervision, and care. There was no community system waiting to receive them, and no political agreement about what should replace the institution. America had seen Byberry. The harder question was whether seeing it would be enough to change what the country continued asking the hospital to do. The photographs published in 1946 made it difficult for Pennsylvania to claim that it did not know what existed inside Philadelphia State Hospital. The public had seen crowded rooms, naked patients, deteriorating wards, and men reduced to anonymous figures in an institution that described itself as medical. Investigations followed. Officials promised reform. Byberry became a national example of what could happen when public hospitals were allowed to grow beyond effective supervision. Yet the gates remained open. The scandal had exposed the institution's conditions, but it had not removed the conditions that made the institution necessary. Philadelphia still had thousands of residents living with severe mental illness, intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, dementia, and other conditions that families often could not manage without help. There were not enough clinics to treat them near home, not enough supervised housing to support them outside a hospital, and not enough public assistance to make long-term family care possible. Byberry could be condemned, but it could not simply be emptied. In 1947, approximately 6,100 people lived there. Pennsylvania spent an average of about $346 on each patient for the entire year. That amount had to cover food, clothing, heat, medical attention, maintenance, supervision, and the wages of the people responsible for keeping the hospital operating. The number reveals more than poor budgeting. It reveals the expectation placed upon the building. The state wanted Byberry to function as a hospital, a residence, a nursing facility, a shelter, and a secure institution, while spending as little as possible on each person inside. Officials could demand cleaner wards and more humane treatment, but those demands had limited meaning when the staff remained too small and the population remained immense. Reform, therefore, took the form most familiar to the institution: construction. Pennsylvania added buildings, renovated older wards, and attempted to modernize parts of the campus. New structures offered better plumbing, improved medical space, and rooms designed according to more recent standards. For some residents, conditions did improve. A cleaner ward, a less crowded sleeping area, or a more attentive staff could make an enormous difference in daily life. But every improvement also helped preserve the system that had created the crisis. A new building relieved pressure without changing the reason so many people were being sent to Byberry. More beds allowed the state to move residents out of the worst wards, but they also allowed the institution to accept more people. Construction could be presented as reform because something visible had been completed. A community network of housing, family support, and outpatient treatment would have been slower, more complicated, and divided among many agencies. The hospital remained the simpler administrative answer. During the 1950s, psychiatry itself began to change. New forms of psychotherapy attracted attention, and hospitals experimented with occupational programs, group activities, and attempts to prepare selected patients for life outside. The arrival of antipsychotic drugs offered the most significant hope. For some people experiencing severe hallucinations, delusions, or agitation, medication reduced symptoms that had previously made discharge difficult. The drugs altered what appeared possible. Patients once expected to remain institutionalized for life could sometimes leave locked wards, participate in work, and return to relatives or supervised residences. Across the country, officials began to imagine that the era of the enormous state hospital might be approaching its end. At Byberry, however, medicine could not repair everything the institution had absorbed. A drug could reduce hallucinations, but it could not provide an apartment. It could make conversation possible, but it could not restore a family relationship damaged by years of separation. It could help a person leave a ward, but it could not guarantee employment, transportation, regular meals, or someone willing to respond during the next crisis. The hospital contained many people whose needs were not solved by medication alone. Some had lived inside institutions for decades and had lost the habits required for independent life. Others had physical disabilities or intellectual limitations that demanded continuing support. Some no longer had relatives who could receive them. For these residents, discharge required an entire social structure that Pennsylvania had not yet built. Byberry continued to hold several realities at once. There were physicians, nurses, attendants, and therapists who tried to provide careful treatment under difficult conditions. There were wards where residents received medication, recreation, and preparation for discharge. There were also buildings where too few employees were responsible for too many people, and where the practical goal remained getting everyone safely through another day. This unevenness made the institution difficult to describe honestly. Byberry was not one unchanging chamber of cruelty. It was a vast campus in which improvement and neglect could exist a short distance apart. A resident's experience depended on the building, the ward, the diagnosis, the employees on duty, and the amount of attention available at a particular moment. That uncertainty was itself part of the danger. A public hospital responsible for thousands of vulnerable people could not depend on the presence of an unusually patient attendant or a well-managed ward. Humane care had to be built into the system. At Byberry, it too often remained an exception created by individuals working against the pressure of the institution around them. Reports of preventable injuries, harsh restraint, poor supervision, and deaths connected to neglect continued to surface during the 1950s and 1960s. The details varied, and some later accounts repeated claims without complete documentation. What remained consistent was the pattern. The scandal of 1946 had not eliminated the conditions that allowed serious failures to occur. By the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, the population approached its highest level. Surviving accounts disagree on the exact peak, placing it somewhere between 6,885 and more than 7,000 residents. The safest conclusion is also the most revealing. Nearly 7,000 people were living inside a hospital originally created as a small rural extension of Blockley. Byberry had survived national disgrace not because the photographs had been disproved, and not because the hospital had fully corrected what they showed. It survived because every level of government still needed the work it performed. The building housed people whom families, courts, relief agencies, and other hospitals could not support. Closing it would have required Pennsylvania to confront all of those needs at once, so the campus continued to spread. Its wards filled, its boilers ran, its kitchens prepared thousands of meals, and its staff carried out the routines of a city that officially remained a hospital. Byberry was now larger than ever. But at the moment the institution reached the height of its power, the country was beginning to question the assumption that had sustained it for half a century, that people with mental illness had to disappear behind the walls of places like this at all. In October 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed legislation intended to move American mental health care in a new direction. Federal grants would help communities construct local treatment centers, allowing more people to receive care near their families instead of disappearing into distant state hospitals. Kennedy described the change as a new approach, one that would gradually replace custodial institutions with prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation closer to home. The law did not close Byberry, and it did not create a complete community system overnight, but it gave national authority to an idea that had been gathering strength for years. The enormous state hospital, once presented as the most humane answer to mental illness, was increasingly viewed as part of the problem. Several forces pushed in the same direction. Antipsychotic drugs made it possible for some patients to machine symptoms outside locked wards. Court decisions strengthened the rights of people held in institutions and challenged confinement without meaningful treatment. Medicare and Medicaid changed how care could be financed, often making nursing homes and community services more practical than long stays in state hospitals. Families and former patients also began questioning whether isolation itself caused harm. Together, these changes accelerated deinstitutionalization, the long process of moving people out of large psychiatric institutions and into hospitals, clinics, group homes, family residences, and independent housing. At Byberry, the population began to fall. Some residents returned to relatives after years away. Others entered supervised homes or smaller facilities. People who responded well to medication could attend outpatient appointments instead of spending every day inside the hospital. For those who received stable housing and reliable support, leaving Byberry brought something the institution could never fully provide: an ordinary address, personal choices, and a life not organized around the needs of a ward. But community care did not develop evenly. The federal government helped construct centers without guaranteeing enough money to operate all of them over the long term. Services varied from one neighborhood to another. A patient might be discharged with medication and an appointment, then discover that transportation was difficult, housing was unstable, or the nearest clinic had more clients than it could manage. Some people moved successfully into the community. Others passed between emergency rooms, temporary residences, jails, family homes, and brief returns to psychiatric hospitals. Freedom from an institution was meaningful, but freedom without dependable support could become another form of abandonment. Byberry nevertheless continued to shrink. Buildings that had once held hundreds of people stood partly empty. Wards closed. Staff positions disappeared. The institution that had approached 7,000 residents at its height seemed to be moving toward a quieter and more manageable future. The appearance was misleading. A falling census did not create a modern hospital. Byberry still occupied a campus of more than 50 buildings, many designed for the assumptions of an earlier century. Boilers, tunnels, plumbing systems, kitchens, roads, roofs, and electrical networks had to be maintained even when fewer patients occupied the grounds. Empty space did not reduce every expense. In some cases, it spread a smaller staff across an aging property that remained difficult to supervise. The population left behind was also changing. Many people who could be discharged with limited assistance had already gone. Those who remained were more likely to have severe and persistent mental illnesses, physical disabilities, long histories of institutionalization, or behavior that smaller programs were unwilling or unable to manage. Some had become involved with the courts and required secure treatment. Others had spent so much of their lives inside hospitals that ordinary decisions outside them had become unfamiliar. Byberry was smaller, but the needs within it were often more complex. The institution also carried forward habits formed during the years of overcrowding. Life still followed the requirements of the building. Meals arrived according to a central schedule. Movement depended on staff permission. Medication, bathing, sleeping, recreation, and visits were organized for groups rather than individuals. Sociologists called places like this total institutions because nearly every part of life occurred under one authority. Residents lived, ate, slept, worked, and received treatment within the same controlled system. Reducing the number of patients did not automatically change that culture. A ward could contain fewer people and still treat them as a population to be managed rather than as separate human beings. By the mid-1980s, the contradiction had become difficult to explain. Byberry no longer held thousands of people packed into every available room. Yet allegations of neglect, unnecessary force, and poor treatment continued. The old defense, that no institution could properly manage such an enormous census, was losing its power. In 1987, approximately 500 patients remained. That was a small fraction of the population Byberry had held 3 decades earlier. Investigators nevertheless described the hospital as a clinical and management nightmare. Reports identified too few nurses and attendants for the needs of the patients who remained. Rooms smelled of urine. Floors were sticky. Plumbing leaked. Mattresses were torn. Basic supplies could be difficult to obtain. Complaints suggested that patients were sometimes given excessive medication because there were not enough employees to supervise them through other methods. Mechanical restraint and seclusion remained central concerns. Both could be used during a genuine emergency when a person presented an immediate danger. But investigators and advocates argued that Byberry relied on them too often, sometimes arbitrarily and sometimes for the convenience of an understaffed ward. The same institutional logic seen in the 1930s had survived into the 1980s. When employees lacked time, isolating a patient could replace careful observation. When a ward lacked enough trained staff, medication could replace conversation. When complaints threatened the hospital, internal procedures could protect the organization more effectively than they protected the person making the complaint. This was Byberry's most revealing transformation. At its height, neglect could be blamed on overwhelming numbers. Now most of the beds were empty, yet the mechanisms of neglect remained. The problem was no longer only that the hospital had grown too large. The hospital had spent decades learning how to operate without placing the individual patient at the center of its decisions. Officials had reduced the institution without rebuilding its culture. They had removed thousands of residents but left the old walls, the old routines, and much of the old balance of power behind. Among the remaining patients was a young woman named Anna Jennings. She had entered psychiatric institutions after years of trauma that the medical system had repeatedly misunderstood. At Byberry, she began recording what she saw: forced medication, restraint, seclusion, and the treatment of patients who had little power to make themselves believed. 40 years earlier, evidence had escaped Byberry hidden inside a camera. This time, it would leave on pieces of paper. When Anna Jennings arrived at Byberry in 1984, she was 24 years old and already knew the rhythms of institutional life. She had spent much of the previous decade moving through psychiatric hospitals, learning when doors would be locked, when medication would be given, and how quickly a person's objections could be recorded as another symptom. According to the history later published by her family and the Anna Institute, Anna had been sexually abused before she was 3 years old and suffered further abuse as she grew older. Her behavior changed, but the mental health system of the 1960s and 1970s had little understanding of how childhood trauma could shape anger, fear, withdrawal, or resistance. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia as a teenager and began entering institutions at 15. The central question asked by those institutions was what disorder she had. Far less attention was given to what had happened to her. By the time Anna reached Philadelphia State Hospital, she had learned that losing control over her surroundings could also mean losing control over her body. Staff could decide when she slept, where she went, what medication she received, and whether she would be placed in seclusion or restraint. When she resisted, the resistance itself could be used as evidence that stronger control was necessary. Yet one part of Anna's identity remained difficult for the institution to reduce to a diagnosis. She was an artist. She drew and painted from childhood, working in oils, watercolors, and sketches without formal training. During her 2 years at Byberry, hospital staff commissioned pieces, displayed her work, and used one of her paintings on material prepared for a conference. Her art could be treated as evidence of talent, insight, and discipline. Her testimony was treated differently. That contradiction reached beyond Anna herself. Byberry could recognize a patient's ability when it produced something the institution wished to display. It was less willing to recognize the same patient's judgment when she described what the institution was doing to the people under its care. Her paintings could leave the ward with approval. Her words had to be carried out secretly. Anna reported seeing patients struck, pulled by their hair, and handled with unnecessary force. She tried to bring her concerns to administrators, but the complaints did not lead to the changes she believed were needed. She began writing down what she witnessed, creating accounts of incidents that would otherwise have remained inside the ward. The notes were passed to her mother, Ann Jennings, who worked with the Mental Health Association of Southeastern Pennsylvania. Their importance did not come from polished language or official credentials. They came from their source. A patient was documenting the daily operation of a hospital that controlled nearly every part of her life. Doing so carried risk. Anna depended on the same institution she was accusing. Staff members could determine whether she received privileges, medication, seclusion, or restraint. In a system where resistance was easily interpreted as illness, even an accurate complaint could be used against the person making it. But her accounts did not stand alone. Inside Byberry, some employees had reached their own limit. 39 hospital workers signed a letter asking officials to address a range of problems, including inadequate staffing and the excessive use of restraint and seclusion. Other employees spoke anonymously to advocates. Their allegations described patients being over-medicated when there were too few people to supervise them, basic hygiene being neglected, and reports of abuse failing to produce meaningful discipline. Federal inspectors also found serious deficiencies. The hospital lacked enough nurses. Rooms smelled of urine. Floors were sticky, plumbing leaked, and mattresses were torn. These were not isolated cosmetic failures. They showed what happened when an institution responsible for vulnerable people could no longer maintain the basic environment in which treatment was supposed to occur. The evidence now came from several directions at once. Patients described mistreatment. Employees described a system that made proper care difficult. Advocates gathered testimony. Inspectors documented physical conditions. Each source strengthened the others. Secretary of Public Welfare John F. White Jr. established a Blue Ribbon Committee to investigate Philadelphia State Hospital. The committee's findings went beyond the behavior of a few abusive employees. It concluded that Byberry's physical and clinical environment created opportunities for patients to be harmed by other patients and by members of the staff. The hospital had procedures for reporting abuse. On paper, complaints could be filed, reviewed, and investigated. The deeper failure came afterward. The committee found that reports were not consistently followed up, including allegations involving employees whose names appeared repeatedly. Byberry did not lack rules. It lacked a culture willing to enforce those rules when doing so threatened established routines, co-workers, or administrators. This distinction mattered because replacing one attendant or repairing one ward could not solve it. The problem had become part of the institution's method of survival. Employees adapted to shortages. Supervisors adapted to complaints. Administrators adapted to inspections. Each crisis produced paperwork and promises, while the structure beneath them remained largely intact. Anna's notes helped break that cycle because they arrived when the institution had fewer defenses left. The population had already fallen from nearly 7,000 to about 500. Byberry could no longer explain its failures entirely through overwhelming numbers. Decades of reform had given the hospital time to change, yet investigators were still finding the same dependence on control, the same physical decay, and the same difficulty protecting patients who spoke. On December 7, 1987, Governor Robert Casey announced that Philadelphia State Hospital would close. Anna Jennings did not close Byberry alone. That conclusion would replace a complicated public struggle with a simpler story than the evidence supports. The decision came after years of pressure from patients, relatives, hospital workers, mental health advocates, inspectors, journalists, and public officials. It also came at a moment when Pennsylvania was reconsidering the future of its large state hospitals, but Anna's role was essential. Her notes helped transform suffering that could be dismissed as rumor into a record that demanded investigation. She described the institution from the position of someone subjected to its authority, and her mother helped carry that description into a world capable of acting upon it. After decades of exposés, commissions, new administrators, and promised reforms, Pennsylvania had finally decided that Byberry could not be repaired simply by trying again. The decision answered what would happen to the hospital. It did not yet answer what would happen to the people inside. For families whose relatives required constant care, the announcement did not sound only like liberation. It also sounded like the removal of the last place legally required to receive them. Byberry had failed its patients, but it still provided beds, meals, medication, and supervision. Closing it responsibly would require Pennsylvania to build those forms of support somewhere else. The notes had escaped the hospital. Now the patients would have to do the same. The decision to close Byberry settled one question and opened several more difficult ones. Pennsylvania had concluded that the hospital could no longer be repaired. But nearly 500 people still depended on it for food, medication, shelter, and supervision. Some had lived in institutions for decades. Others had illnesses that could become dangerous without continuous support. Closing the gates was simple compared with deciding where those people would go. Many families approached the announcement with fear rather than relief. They had heard the reports of abuse and neglect. Some had seen the conditions themselves. Their objections did not necessarily mean they believed Byberry was humane. They feared that the alternative might be no hospital at all. A relative who required medication every day, help preparing meals, or supervision during a crisis could not simply be given an address and expected to manage. Families worried that discharged patients would stop treatment, lose housing, wander the streets, or enter the criminal justice system. For them, the state hospital had become both a danger and a final safety net. The closure, therefore, had to accomplish two things that could easily work against each other. It had to end an institution that harmed people, while preserving the forms of assistance those same people still needed. State officials promised that the money used to operate Byberry would follow the patients into the community. In principle, this offered a rare opportunity. Rather than allowing the hospital budget to disappear into general spending, Pennsylvania could use it to build housing, outpatient treatment, crisis programs, rehabilitation services, and daily support across Philadelphia. The first numbers weakened that promise. In 1989, advocates were shown a plan providing approximately $16 million for community services. Those working directly with Byberry's remaining residents believed the amount was far below what responsible closure required. A hospital concentrated hundreds of people, employees, beds, kitchens, medication rooms, and emergency services in one place. Reproducing its necessary functions across an entire city would require more than simply renting apartments. People would need staff members who could visit them at home. Some would need supervised residences operating around the clock. Clinics would have to prescribe and monitor medication. Crisis teams would need to respond before police became the only available authority. Programs would have to teach skills that years of institutional life had allowed to disappear. The debate created an unusual alliance. Former patients who had spent years fighting institutional authority joined families who had once feared discharge. Psychiatrists, hospital employees, attorneys, service providers, and mental health activists came together as the Coalition for a Responsible Closure. These groups did not agree on every question. Some emphasized liberty and the right to live outside institutions. Others emphasized safety and the severity of illnesses that could not be wished away. What united them was the belief that closing Byberry without adequate services would not be reform. It would merely transfer neglect from a visible hospital to streets, apartments, shelters, and jails. The coalition argued that Philadelphia needed closer to $50 million. Events soon showed why caution was necessary. During the discharge process, 2 former Byberry patients died by suicide. Governor Robert Casey halted the closure. Another recently discharged patient died by suicide soon afterward. Each death raised painful questions about preparation, supervision, and whether the desire to empty the hospital had begun moving faster than the system being built outside it. Their deaths did not prove that institutionalization was safer. People had also died through neglect, violence, and despair inside Byberry, but they demonstrated that release alone could not be confused with care. A person could leave a locked ward and still remain profoundly vulnerable. Freedom required somewhere to live, someone to call, and a system willing to respond before a crisis became irreversible. The deaths and the inadequate budget threatened the entire project. Families could point to them as evidence that closure was reckless. Officials could have delayed the process indefinitely or transferred most of the remaining residents to another state hospital, preserving the institutional model under a different name. Instead, the pressure forced Pennsylvania and Philadelphia to construct a more serious alternative. The Coalition for a Responsible Closure secured a budget of approximately $50 million. Former patients also filed a lawsuit, and the resulting settlement helped guarantee that funding would be available for community services rather than ending when the hospital closed. The system that emerged was later described by researchers as unbundling. At Byberry, almost every service had been tied to one institution. The hospital provided housing, meals, treatment, recreation, supervision, and emergency control within the same grounds. Unbundling separated those functions and placed them with different community organizations. A nonprofit agency might operate a group home. Another might provide psychiatric treatment. A mobile team could respond during a crisis, while a rehabilitation program helped someone find work or relearn the routines of daily life. Instead of making one building responsible for an entire human existence, the new model attempted to create a network around each person. That approach had weaknesses. Separate providers could fail to communicate. Patients could become lost between agencies. Funding had to continue year after year, long after the political attention surrounding Byberry had faded. But the model allowed people to live in ordinary neighborhoods and receive help without surrendering every part of life to a single authority. Philadelphia did not merely transfer most Byberry residents to another large hospital. People moved into group homes, supervised apartments, family settings, and other less restrictive environments. Employees from the hospital found work in the new network, carrying useful experience into a system that was supposed to operate on a more personal scale. On June 21, 1990, Philadelphia State Hospital closed permanently. Later studies found that many former residents adjusted to community life more successfully than opponents had predicted. Their lives were not free from illness or difficulty, but they were no longer defined entirely by an institution. Danny Butts had spent a year at Byberry as a young man diagnosed with schizophrenia. His life outside was not immediately stable. He required further hospitalization before finding medication that worked for him. but he eventually lived independently and joined the Behavioral Health Training and Education Network, helping train mental health workers from the perspective of someone who had once been under their authority. His experience showed why the result could not be reduced to either success or failure. Community care did not cure him or remove every crisis. It gave him the possibility of building a life between those crises. Not every story ended that way. Anna Jennings left Byberry, but she did not escape the larger institutional system. In 1992, at the age of 32, she died by suicide while confined in another state hospital. The building she helped expose had closed, yet the failures that shaped her life extended far beyond its grounds. Byberry's closure proved that a large state institution could be replaced when money, housing, treatment, and public commitment followed the people leaving it. It did not prove that abandonment had disappeared. Community care remained only as humane as the resources society continued to provide. By the summer of 1990, the patients were gone. The wards were silent. The kitchens had stopped serving meals, and the employees no longer crossed the grounds at each change of shift. More than 50 buildings remained. A place created to contain the people Philadelphia preferred not to see had now become something the city itself wanted to place out of sight. When the last patients left Byberry in June 1990, the hospital did not disappear with them. Its wards remained, their windows boarded, and their corridors emptied of the routines that had governed thousands of lives. Pennsylvania had ended the institution, but Philadelphia was left with a physical reminder of what it had been. Removing it was neither quick nor simple. The buildings contained asbestos, lead paint, and other hazardous materials that made demolition expensive. Questions about security, cleanup, ownership, and future land use delayed a final decision. For roughly 16 years, the hospital stood without patients and without a clear purpose. Abandonment changed Byberry quickly. Copper wiring and pipes were stripped from the buildings. Fires damaged rooms that had survived decades of use. Water entered through broken roofs, paint peeled from the walls, and vegetation pushed into courtyards. Graffiti spread across rooms once identified by ward numbers and medical functions. The empty hospital attracted trespassers, photographers, and urban explorers. By the early years of the Internet, Byberry had acquired a second life. Images of tunnels, darkened wards, rusted bed frames, and collapsing ceilings traveled far beyond Northeast Philadelphia. People who knew little about the hospital's history came to know the appearance of its ruins. Claims circulated about ghosts, secret rituals, hidden experiments, unexplained deaths, and events for which no reliable record has been found. Once Byberry became a place entered at night with flashlights and cameras, its history could be rearranged into a familiar tale of a cursed asylum. The legends made the site memorable, but they also reduced the people who had lived there to scenery. Patients became figures imagined at the end of corridors. Their illnesses, families, work, art, complaints, and attempts to build lives were replaced by a general sense that something terrible had happened inside. Something terrible had happened inside. But the documented history was more demanding than a ghost story. It could be found in budgets that expected one institution to care for thousands of people with too little money. It could be found in restraint records, death registers, inspection reports, Charlie Lord's photographs, Anna Jennings' notes, and survivor testimony. Byberry's most consequential failures did not require a hidden chamber. They occurred in ordinary wards, through decisions recorded by public agencies. Demolition began in 2006. Buildings that had taken decades to construct were dismantled, their hazardous materials removed, and much of their masonry carried away or reused. Part of the property became the Arbors at Eagle Point, a residential community for adults 55 and older. Other sections of the former hospital tract and the surrounding Byberry area were absorbed into industrial development, housing, roads, and open space. In 2025, the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation announced the sale of its final parcel in Byberry Industrial Park, ending a redevelopment effort that had extended across more than 40 years. By then, land once chosen because it stood beyond the crowded city had been incorporated into ordinary urban life. The removal of the buildings did not erase Byberry's influence. Its closure became a model for later Pennsylvania hospital closures because Philadelphia did not simply move most residents into another large institution. The money, services, and responsibilities once concentrated on one campus were divided among community programs. The process was difficult and incomplete, but it demonstrated that people with severe mental illness could live outside a state hospital when housing, treatment, crisis response, and daily support followed them. That condition matters. Byberry did not prove that closing institutions was automatically humane. It proved that closure had to be financed as carefully as the institution it replaced. Without sustained community services, the old problem could reappear in shelters, emergency rooms, family homes, and jails. Anna Jennings left another kind of legacy. After her death, her mother used Anna's life and artwork to educate professionals about childhood trauma and the harm caused when survival responses are treated only as symptoms of disease. The work associated with the Anna Institute contributed to a broader trauma-informed approach, understanding what a person has endured before deciding what that person's behavior means. It was a direct challenge to the logic Anna had encountered throughout her life. Institutions had repeatedly asked how to control her. Her history required them first to understand what had happened to her. Philadelphia has never created a memorial equal to the scale of Byberry's history. Mental health advocates have called for a marker, mural, or monument honoring the people who lived and died there. Redevelopment explains what happened to the property. It does not explain what the property meant. The fields from which Byberry began are no longer beyond the city. Philadelphia expanded around them, then dismantled the institution and absorbed the land. The farm, the wards, and the abandoned ruins belong to different eras, but each served the same public desire to make a difficult problem manageable through space. Byberry should not be remembered simply as a cursed hospital. Nor should it be treated only as proof that every institution must fail. It should be remembered as a building that exposed the limits of architecture as social policy. Philadelphia used distance, acreage, wards, and locked doors to gather needs it had not learned to meet elsewhere. When the hospital closed, those needs did not vanish. They had to be carried back into the community from which the patients had been removed. The buildings are gone. What remains is the question that created them: how a society cares for people who cannot always live safely without help, without turning that help into control, neglect, or disappearance. Byberry was not haunted by the dead. It was haunted by a public choice that remains familiar: the choice to place difficult human needs inside a building and mistake their removal from view for their resolution.